the medieval period, women were seen as lesser. By some, they were deformed men with the reliability and trustworthiness of a mere child. So let us appreciate that Anne, Duchess of Exeter, did any interceding at all in the affairs of her royal brothers. This is her story.
Once upon a time in history.
Hello history nerds, and welcome back to Once Upon a Time in History. And this is Her Stories. This is the series where we focus on the lives of women in history. For the start of this series, I'm focusing on royal women from the medieval period who are lesser mentioned. Elizabeth I, Mary I, Margaret Beaufort and Eleanor of Aquitaine are 4 examples of fantastic women who receive a lot of representation for their interesting and intricate lives. And rightly so, but there was other women. Some roamed royal courts and entangled themselves in the webs of politics, while others kept away, huddled up with a new manuscript besides the warmth of a castle fire. And some did both. The 4 previously mentioned women are arguably interesting, as they're often seen as examples of feminine power in a time when women were so below their male counterparts. But let's still know the lives of women who tightrope walked the line set out for them. Don't forget to follow this podcast or subscribe if you're on YouTube. But without further ado, allow me to introduce Anne. Anne, she was born on the 10th of August 1439 at Fotheringhay Castle. Cecily Neville ended 10 years of baroness by welcoming her first child, a girl who was to be named Anne. Anne's father was Richard, 3rd Duke of York, and the name Anne was likely chosen in honour of his mother, Anne Mortimer. Richard was a proud man with much sense of legacy, as he had a strong throne claim through his maternal descendancy from Edward III's 3rd son, Lionel of Clarence. And this line was one of, or the to some, strongest line for claim to the throne, as Edward III's 2 eldest sons' lines were extinct. The first few years of Anne's life are mysterious. Shortly after the early death of her newborn brother Henry in February of 1441, Anne's parents left England for Rouen, where her father took the position of Lieutenant of Normandy. Unfortunately, we do not know if Anne relocated with them. If she were left in England, it is also unknown who would have been her guardians, but likely it would have been relatives whose household also had young children. If Anne had accompanied her parents, she would have spent the next few years growing up at Rouen Castle. In 1445, Anne either returned to England or was reunited with her parents. In the last 4 years, the family had welcomed 3 more children: Edward, Edmund, and Elizabeth. Despite having newly returned to England, Anne's father already wanted to utilise having a daughter. That is, he wanted to make an alliance. And she wed. On the 30th of January 1446, 6-year-old Anne married Henry Holland, a 15-year-old cousin of King Henry VI. Due to his close relation to the king, Henry was also a throne claimant, so this marriage also gave Anne the possibility of one day becoming a queen consort. If Henry Holland is known for anything, it'll be that a torture device was named after him. The Duke of Exeter's daughter is a torture rack that can be seen within the Tower of London. The marriage was not to be consummated until Anne turned 14, and with this came a clause for Anne to have the marriage annulled at any point until then. It isn't known whether Anne remained with her family or moved to live within the household of her husband's parents, his father John Holland and stepmother Anne Montague. If you've watched or listened to previous episodes, you'll be familiar with John Holland, as I covered his parents in my episode Who Knocked Up the Duchess. 19 months after the marriage, on the 5th of August 1447, John Holland died, causes unknown. Being 17 and with a few years to go before reaching the age of majority, Henry Holland was placed under the guardianship of Richard of York. Anne's location is still unknown, but it's quite possible that she and Henry would spend the next few years in the same household. During these early years of wed, Anne had multiple books of hours. One of these still survives, and I will include it in the description. In 1450, Henry Holland was released from his guardianship to claim full possession of his inheritance and succeed his father in the responsibilities of the title of Duke of Exeter. When he left to run a household of his own, it seems unlikely that Anne, being 10 to 11 years old, accompanied him. But most certainly, she would have been relocated to his household in 1453, when she turned 14. And she was a wife. It's always hoped that arranged marriages lead to a happy one, despite it not being a choice for at least one person. For Anne, this sadly seems unlikely, especially considering contemporary descriptions of Henry Holland's personality. The 20th century historian Paul Murray Kendall described Henry as dangerous and points to Italian sources who viewed the man as cruel and fierce. One example of his abhorrent personality is the case with Lord Ralph Cromwell, at the time Chamberlain of the household of Henry VI. A land disagreement turned sour when Henry, Duke of Exeter, seized the Chamberlain's estates and then made false accusations of treason against him. Despite this, Anne never took advantage of the clause allowing her to dissolve the marriage. Why she chose to remain in the marriage is unknown. It could be that she was persuaded or coerced, or although she wasn't even 14, she may have saw much personal gain to be had. Despite her husband's abysmal personality, his rank brought her much prestige and could promise further privileges and greater gains. Perhaps she would grow to regret this during a particular part of her life. Anne's relationship with her husband was possibly strained, and a close friendship seems very unlikely. Throughout their marriage, Henry would be in sanctuary, imprisoned, or on campaign. Later events would make their terms likely very bitter, but little can be confirmed. Anne's true thoughts on her husband are lost to history. And war brews. We must wonder how 15-year-old Anne felt in 1454 when resentment was most certainly brewing between her father and her husband. Both men had created dreadful reputations for themselves, and Anne was now known to many as the eldest daughter of a power-hungry duke seen as a political reformer, and the wife of a conning duke whose wicked actions had scared off any man from the position of Sheriff of Bedfordshire. But worse was to come. In August of the previous year, the king had suffered a mental breakdown and become unresponsive. 7 months later, this had led to the appointing of Richard, Duke of York, as protector of the realm and chief counsellor. Anne may have had to deal with her husband's infamous temper, as he is recorded to have been outraged, as he believed he should have been the one appointed those positions. What followed was a Henry Holland's rebellion against his father-in-law. When this failed, he took sanctuary in Westminster Abbey, and Richard, Duke of York, created an uproar by not respecting sanctuary and instead removing the Duke of Exeter and imprisoning him at Pontefract Castle. This imprisonment was only to last until March of 1455, but if Anne was reunited with her husband, it was likely brief, as he would be involved in the First Battle of St Albans against York in May the same year, which led to a second imprisonment until February of 1456. For Anne's husband, imprisonment clearly wasn't a deterrent, as he ended up there again just 2 years later from trying to capture the Earl of Warwick. During all this, it seems quite likely that Anne remained in Exeter's lands, but due to his nature, we should probably think her lucky to have not had to put up with him. Anne's father's ambitions had climbed higher, and due to the king's mental state and incompetence, he chose to fight for his claim to the throne. And when he did, Anne's husband, Henry Holland, Duke of Exeter, was on the side of the king, Henry VI, and his supporters. This was York versus Lancaster, the War of the Roses, and it was about to hit its peak. And there was a field of dying roses. 30th December 1460 would be a date burned to scar in Anne's memories. This is the Battle of Wakefield. With her father and brother Edmund leaders of the Yorkist army and her husband Holland a commander of the Lancastrians, we can only imagine how Anne must have felt. On either side, her life as she knew it was threatened. This far-off battle would lead to pain and second-hand humiliation for Anne. The Yorkists lost. Her brother Edmund was brutally killed at just 17 years old as he fled the onslaught when it became apparent they'd lost. Her father didn't have a chance to run. Precisely how either died is not certain. Richard of York may have received a knee injury and then dehorsed, after which he fought until slaughtered. Alternatively, he may have been captured, mocked with a crudely made crown of bulrushes, and then killed. Either way, both would have their heads displayed in triumph for Lancaster's victory. Upon Richard's decomposing head, they shoved a paper crown and a sign, "Let York overlook the town of York." Anne's younger brother Edward was also called to battle but didn't make it. If he had, history would look incredibly different. Anne in 1461. At some point between 1455 and 1461, Anne gave birth to her first child, a daughter named for herself. Her daughter's birth year is usually stated as 1461, but in truth it isn't known for sure, along with her place of birth. What is known is that on the 4th of March, Anne's brother Edward was declared King of England, and Henry VI was deposed. With this, Anne's husband became considered a traitor, as he continued to support the Lancastrians. In April of the same year, Anne must have travelled to join her brother, now known as Edward IV, in Newcastle, where her support would have been recognised. On the 1st of May, at Anne's request, Edward IV transferred the Duke of Exeter's lands to trustworthy hands. The income the properties brought in was to be transferred to Anne. By the end of the year, Edward must have been confident in his sister's loyalty and rewarded her with the entirety of her husband's estates for the duration of her lifetime. In 1464, Anne temporarily had guardianship of 9-year-old Henry, Duke of Buckingham, until he was moved to the household of Queen Elizabeth Woodville, who was Anne's sister-in-law. Anne may have been looking for an advantageous marriage for her daughter, and Buckingham may have been considered or at least discussed. Another may have been the nephew of the kingmaker. 2 years later, Anne also seems to have made arrangements with Elizabeth for a marriage between her young daughter and one of the Queen's sons from her previous marriage. In October of 1466, Anne witnessed the wedding of her daughter, who was as young as 5 at the time, to Thomas Grey, then 11. Elizabeth seems to have given Anne 4,000 marks for the marriage. And she was free. Since 1461, Anne had remained estranged from her husband, and in January of 1470 she initiated divorce proceedings. Her younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence, had been a supporter, even hosting the initial legal discussion. Unfortunately, just a few months in, George rebelled against their brother and in doing so also abandoned his support for Anne's divorce. But things were to get worse, for in October of 1470, Henry VI was reinstated as king, and with this came the return of Anne's husband, who was restored to power. Anne had remained firmly a Yorkist and teamed up with her mother and sisters for an intervention with George, trying to persuade him to return to Yorkist support. It seems the women had some success and played a part in George's final return some months later. On the 14th of April 1471, York and Lancastrian forces met for the Battle of Barnet, the outcome leading to Edward being reinstated as king. During the battle, Anne's husband Henry Holland was severely injured, and he would be abandoned on the battlefield. Later, he was imprisoned. With her brother back ruling, Anne's divorce proceedings continued, and on the 5th of November 1471, it was finalised on the grounds of consanguinity. Anne was free. And the end is nigh. Sometime between 1467 and 1474, Anne's daughter passed away from unknown causes. We know little of her daughter's life, but Anne would have a second opportunity to be a wife and mother, for in 1474 she married Thomas St. Leger. The pair seem to have been lovers before their marriage, but for how long this love had been going on is unknown. Not much is known about Thomas other than that he was incredibly loyal to Edward IV. But there is one story about him. Thomas was involved in a brawl at Westminster Palace. For this, he was to be punished by losing one of his hands. Lucky for him, he was acquitted by Edward IV. The year following Anne and Thomas's marriage, Thomas served on Edward IV's expedition to France. Also serving was Henry Holland. The following circumstances are not fully known, but it may seem as justice served, as Henry Holland was thrown overboard and drowned. Some state this was on the king's orders, others that Thomas threw him over. In 1475, Anne was pregnant with her second daughter and her first child with Thomas. Unfortunately, she would not live to bathe in the glory of motherhood again, as the birth would end with her passing on the 14th of January 1476. Anne was buried on the 1st of February 1476 in her husband's family chantry at the St. George's Chapel of Westminster Palace. She was 36 years old. Thank you so much for watching, History Nerds. Don't forget to pop a like and maybe a comment to share your thoughts. And subscribe, so I will see you next time in another time in history.